But thank you everyone who's turned up for this lunchtime webinar from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. My name's Ed Conway. I'm the economics editor, actually economics and data editor is my technical title, economics and data editor for Sky News, and a governor of NISA, something I'm very proud of. And it's great to be doing this event. I've got to say, like, even before, just in terms of kind of timings, we'll close up kind of promptly at 2:00, because I'm sure you've got things to get to. I'll do a very quick introduction, 5-minute kind of lengthier remarks from each of the panelists at first, and then we'll do a kind of Q&A. And you should ask questions on the chat, and depending on how many we've got, I'll probably field them, but just put them into the chat whenever you feel it's appropriate, and I'll try and ask them either in the course of our conversation or towards the end. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, gosh, the topic could hardly be more relevant, could it? And I think even before the events of the last month and a bit, trade, tariffs, the price of protectionism is kind of not just fascinating, but of incredible importance, but also actually drama, which is not something often is the case in economics. And I guess that's partly because, for much of the post-war period, it felt as if the global economy was on this kind of relatively stable glide path, give or take, some considerable bumps. Ever rising flows of trade, of merchandise, ever falling tariff levels, all presided over and guided by a mostly benign superpower that would set the rules that were mostly seen as fair, sometimes not, but mostly seen as fair, multilaterally agreed at least. And that superpower would police the system and would police international waters. And at the heart of the system was, I guess, a prevailing assumption that if you ordered something from the other side of the world, that the costs of trade, whether that's kind of tariffs or shipping, would be transparent and predictable and would mostly be falling. But also critically, that the ship that you ordered that thing from would actually turn up. We took that for granted. And even before the events in the Persian Gulf, all of that basically had come under question. Whether it started with Brexit or with Donald Trump or before and after, we're in this world where tariffs are now rising and shipping is now under threat, and was before what happened recently. It was under threat in the Red Sea. The Suez Canal was kind of out of action for a lot of ships. And so all of those preconceptions that we had about globalization and the path of globalization have been challenged, not just theoretically, but pragmatically. There have been lots of question marks about globalization for quite a long time, and particularly in the economic community, as many of you are very familiar with. But the fact that it's actually a very physical, kinetic moment is shocking and surprising, or maybe not surprising. Globalization, in short, seems to be fracturing. And then, of course, we all know what happened next. So, another choke point, even more significant choke point, closes. Trade is even more under threat. Relations are even more strained. And so where does that leave us? Does the disinflation that we've seen in recent decades, does that turn to inflation? Can self-sufficiency actually work in practice? What does economics tell us about where we are now? And is this a shift from a hyper-globalization that some people would debate had actually gone too far to something more functional? Or is it a more chaotic kind of future that we have to contend with right now? For this, we have a fantastic panel. I know you'll be familiar with all of the panelists. So just very brief introductions. Silvana Tenreyro, LSE Professor of Economics, former MPC member. Janet Henry, Global Chief Economist at HSBC. And Linda Yueh, economist, writer, broadcaster, fellow at Oxford and London Business School. As I say, so much to talk about. Let's just go through, and so each of the panelists can have 5 minutes and just set out their stall on kind of where we are right now. Hopefully disagree a little bit with each other. That's my hope, but we'll see what happens. and then we'll have a kind of Q&A afterwards. And let's start with Silvana. I mean, we were talking beforehand about this question of self-sufficiency and whether it is this attainable goal, and that this world of tomorrow that we might be living in. Perhaps you might want to expand on that, but also whatever is on your mind at the moment. Silvana.
Thank you very much, Ed. So let's talk about self-sufficiency. If the goal here is building resilience and de-risking, self-sufficiency and reshoring are actually very expensive and also very risky. We need a more robust strategy, and such strategy involves 3 legs. First, more technological diversification to reduce exposure to critical or less substitutable inputs. We need more investment in technologies and skills that are critical for our economies, and we need that investment to be done at scale. So in the case of concretely of energy, for example, we need to diversify the sources of energy. We cannot rely just on gas or oil. We need to broaden to wind, nuclear, hydro, and so on. The second leg in that strategy should involve more trade diversification, and that requires trade particularly with countries that have low geopolitical risk or are more aligned geopolitically. That diversification of trade allows for lower volatility because we can diversify the input suppliers and buyers, which will reduce the exposure to any specific supplier or buyer, and also reduce exposure to our own domestic shocks. So this advocates against simplistic solutions like reshoring or self-sufficiency to build resilience. Closing the economy actually makes us more exposed to domestic shocks. Think about climate-related events like floods and droughts and so on. Reshoring makes us more rather than less vulnerable. And the third component in that strategy, which complements the other two, involves supply buffers, expanding storage capacity, building inventory bases to be prepared for shocks to critical supply, whether it's energy, water, food, but also other inputs in the production process. And here we have parallels between the supply of critical inputs and the financial system, and we've been through that already. Cross-border linkages, concentration risk, complexity. Holding inventories or building supply buffers is akin to holding liquidity. And the whole logic of diversification applies both on the real and the financial side. And so we need to use that knowledge that we acquire post-financial crisis and apply it to this real side. I will pause here. I'm happy to come back to some of these issues.
Okay, thanks for that, Silvana. Janet, do you want to go next? I don't know if you wanted to talk specifically about the UK or more broadly, but obviously we're kind of right in the thick of this as this open trading nation, and clearly it's going to have enormous consequences for us, even if it's kind of feels like we're still at the beginning of this new period. What's your feelings?
Well, no, I mean, I completely agree with the comments that you made as your opening remarks and the ones that Silvana just painted a picture for. We came out of this era, as you said, of hyper-globalisation, and then Silvana has very clearly presented an outlook where there will be costs in terms of higher inflation and lower growth than would have been the case under an ongoing hyper-globalisation, for want of a better term. So we have got that deterioration in the growth inflation trade-off. And I just make a few points. First of all, I would like to just make a point about what's happened to the pace of global growth against a backdrop of tariffs, because clearly we look back at 2025, and despite those dark days of Liberation Day and those enormous announcements, the tariffs were not as big as initially proposed. And I think global trade growth was actually a lot stronger because there are plenty of other regions in the world that don't include the US. And actually, what a lot of us perhaps underestimated at the start of the year was the sheer strength of the global AI story and the rollout of the whole AI related ecosystem, which I still think is going to be some kind of support to global demand, even against this world of friction. But to your point about the UK seems to be in the thick of it, you could actually draw some comparisons potentially with what's been happening in the UK in recent years, with what's happening in the US. To some extent, in the US, this is something of the America's Brexit in terms of what it's meant for certain inflows of immigration. And in the US case, tariffs, as opposed to the UK, it was more the impact of non-tariff barriers. And what I would say is that, there is a macroeconomic impact as a consequence of this. The ONS does publish a monthly survey, their Business Insights survey, which is based on over about 10,000 responses. And the question that they always ask is, what was the main reason for global supply chain disruption? And every month last year, there was maybe 1 or 2 months when tariffs was top of the list. But the persistent and still the most recent, as of February, top of the list disruption to global supply chain disruption is actually Brexit. Now, to some extent, the UK is a little bit more immune, given the dependence on services, but it's clear that it is still weighing on the uncertainty related outcome. And we can also, I think, what is worth making the point on the UK is that even on tariffs, if we go back to April last year, the sense was that the UK was going to get a better trade deal. We originally got a better trade deal from the US, but now that we had the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, the relative advantage of the UK having a better trade deal is actually a lot less. So, there's a lot we can delve into on the UK and on the trade side, but one relative area of support is that the UK is, it's underperformed on the goods side massively compared with the rest of Europe, but it is less exposed to tariffs because goods are relatively less important, because actually the service sector, the side of exports, have actually been quite resilient in the UK over the course of the last year. So I could go on, but maybe I'll stop there and we can wait and come up with a lot more during the Q&A session.
Sure. No, that's great. That's really interesting. Thank you, Jenna. Linda, give us your sense at the moment of I mean, when you kind of stare out at the conjunction of all of these different forces, is it mostly just interesting, or is it mostly just scary for you right now? And give us your take.
Well, it's certainly I guess it is certainly interesting. And I'm not sure interesting is a positive word.
But you live in interesting times.
I'll spend a few minutes, I think, I maybe just building a bit on, I think the scene setting that's already been helpfully set out. I'm actually, I'll probably say a word about supply chains specifically, because a lot of the tariffs that we've currently seen hits supply chains, but specifically parts of the supply chain. So the US tariffs, are generally targeted towards connector countries. So countries within the part of the global value chain that are the final exporter to the United States. If you look at the trade data, Vietnam was not one of the big trade surplus countries, but it became so because the use of tariffs, which of course just the tax, have been used for a decade. I don't know, you think, oh no, 2016. Oh, that was a decade ago. So after the 2018 tariffs, under the first Trump administration, companies started to take on what's called a China Plus One strategy. It's now China Plus Plus. But China Plus One meant that global value chains were being repositioned, in part because of rising costs in China, but also because you did have the sense that you needed to create a bit more resilience. So the issue with the current focus on trade surplus countries is that it's a bit of a moving target, because once global value chains move, almost by definition, the final exporter to the US is going to be the country that could become more in focus. So it's also Mexico, and that has to do with NAFTA 2.0, which I know is technically not called NAFTA 2.0, but because they couldn't come up with a name for it. If you were American, you would call it USMCA. If you were Mexican, you would call it Mexico, MCUS anyway. So I call it NAFTA 2.0. So I guess what that's suggesting is a couple of things. So for the UK and other countries, if you want supply chain resilience, it does mean having optionality. The question is, what does optionality look like? So moving supply chains, as we've currently seen, is actually probably more possible than perhaps we would have thought, because these days supply chains can be capital light. You can use technology, and I'll give a bit of a Brexit example here, because a lot of the resilience that was built into a post-Brexit world in the UK involved putting more inventory into, say, warehouses in the UK. And actually, that was then deployed after the COVID crisis, where the increased stock was more useful. So in other words, we moved from just in time, which was the supply chain management system, the predominant one that we had previously, to just in case, which is this kind of resilience, which is a bit more costly. But technology using something like demand sensing can actually move inventory and supply chain management closer back to just in time. So I guess that's sort of wrapping up some thoughts on supply chains, as we tend to think of it as tariffs dislocation. And obviously it is a big deal. So for instance, the tariffs in the US, which were not struck down, so the Section 232 sectoral tariffs, which are levied on things like aluminium. Now there's about 400 products the UK exports to the US, which are caught up in that. So so tariffs are a big deal. Geopolitics are a big deal. But the other big part of it is actually technology, changing the way supply chain management can actually be done. And the other example I tend to give, which is I found fascinating, and this is actually from a decade ago, is 3D printing, additive manufacturing. Over 90% of aircrafts today have a 3D printed part. The shortening of supply chain is technologically driven as well. So it doesn't mean you don't need resilience, because you do. And that is about having plan B, plan C, plan D, plan E. So I just think that, but the ability to be nimble is greater, because technology itself is giving you optionality. And then I suppose the other final thought is, this crisis in the Middle East currently has raised issues, not just around energy prices, but actually around urea, bromide, helium. So in other words, the commodity side of it, and we saw this in the Russia-Ukraine war as well, that's contributing to cost of living price pressures, which we feel here in the UK acutely. So what that's suggesting is security. So that's input security, energy security. So the terms that are now, I think, much more, certainly in use, is resilience and some form of security. But I would just finish by saying it does not suggest that the overall picture is one in which somehow globalization is necessarily, it's under pressure, it's different. But there is a paradox of globalization, which is we're actually more connected than ever before. Because of data, information flows, technology, even as the geopolitics seems to be putting pressure and making us feel more insular. But actually, if you look at, where we, the ability to work from home, doing webinars like this, having audiences from around the world, we're more connected. So I find that to be quite fascinating. Obviously, the fastest areas of global trade are actually digital, trade and digitalization. So I just think there's a lot of reasons to be a bit cheerful as well. So clearly I'm in the wrong profession sometimes, dismal science and all that. But I think there's, there's still a lot of, as the Americans would say, there's opportunity. By the way, when an American says there's opportunity, it just means that there's a really big challenge. They just recharacterize it as opportunity.
It's a good attitude to have. And it's really interesting, Linda, particularly the thinking about and listening to Silvana about this future of more inventory and more storage and, I guess just in case versus just in time, the natural assumption a lot of people have is that that's just a more inefficient world. But actually, the notion that various different forms of technology, whether it's kind of IT or 3D printing, can efface that, that's quite a big deal. And actually, that's quite hopeful. I guess Silvana, one kind of broader follow up is, were you surprised at the comparative resilience of global trade in the face of what we've seen in the last kind of few years, in the face of tariffs, in the face of so much talk about the end of globalization? I mean, there were lots of somewhat bearish forecasts initially, which maybe weren't borne out by events. Is this not as bad as everyone was fearing?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two parts to the answer here. One is that if you look at US imports, they are about 15% of global imports. And global imports are less than 30% of global GDP. So if you multiply those two, we're talking about 4% of global GDP being affected by tariffs. And the tariffs, I mean, even though we started with very high numbers, effectively the average effective tariff is in the order of 13%. So it's a 13% on that 4%, which is not catastrophic, and so that's why we've seen more resilience. And the other part to the answer, and Janet mentioned it, is that we've seen at the same time a big boom in AI and AI-driven trade. So that compensated from any impact on the other 4% of global GDP, and more than compensated. So we haven't seen globalization understood as or measured as the flow of global trade over GDP stalling or retreating. If anything, it's continued its course.
Yeah, if I can come in on that as well, Ed.
Yeah.
I completely agree with Silvana. The US is not everywhere, and if there's one learning we've had over the last year, actually, is that especially trade between the US and China, which Linda rightly made the point, a lot of it's now going through other Asian countries to ultimately get to the US. But we did find out that the US was more reliant on a lot of the inputs that came from China than China was on the soybeans and other products that came from the US. They were able to find easier sources. But I think the global AI story, Europe wasn't part of it. Europe's very good at the adoption side. And although Europe's had the investment side, they were not tied into the export angle. But the rest of the world, absolutely. The rest of Asia, not just China, whether it's everything from the ventilators to the chips to every element of the AI ecosystem. And of course, parts of Latin America, the industrial commodities, the copper and the lithium and all of these other products that form part of it. So if I look back to some of those early projections that we made, that's probably, even though we were all talking about it, we underestimated just quite what a lift it would give to global trade growth to offset what were some headwinds from the tariffs.
And the extent to which, I guess, trade, the strength of supply and demand on different parts of the world, it's easy to kind of underestimate the means and the ends people will go to try to get stuff that I was really struck in the last few years, kind of somewhat different story, but I guess with similar lessons about Russian sanctions and the extent to which goods that are banned from going directly from Europe to Russia just end up going to Kyrgyzstan or to Azerbaijan and to other countries, and you've got kind of a form of diversion that's happening there. I was struck by that as well when you said that, Linda, you were talking about kind of trade from Vietnam rather than kind of directly from China to trade coming from Vietnam to, for instance, the US. Like, do we know at the moment the extent to which that is goods that are basically just leaving China, going into a shed in Vietnam, and then just being exported from Vietnam with a kind of made in Vietnam sticker. Do we have any sense as to whether this is kind of creating kind of permanent changes in actual comparative advantage and economic activity in these different satellite states, or whether it's all just a form of trade diversion in response to tariffs?
So I think, so the connector countries, the countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and actually in terms of foreign direct investment, it's Hungary into Europe. So in all these cases, they get challenged on, just take Mexico as actually the example, because there's more challenge around it, is whether or not to qualify for NAFTA 2.0, you do have to meet rules of origin. So in other words, you can't just be in a warehouse shed and then set. You need to actually have de minimis input from, from China. So Chinese auto company BYD, they basically said, we're just here to sell electric vehicles in Mexico. It's not because of NAFTA 2.0. So this is why I'm using it as an example, because that's an illustration of, the connector countries, the extent to which I do think, if you look at, Vietnam, it has benefited quite a lot from the movement of supply chains around primarily because of rising wage costs in China. So the other example that I'll give is, the maker of Black & Decker power tools. The CEO said that it costs the same to produce in the Carolinas as it does in China, because once you figure in the rising wage costs in China, higher productivity in the United States, including technology, the transit costs, which obviously have gone up, and then the effective labor cost for him was the same once he figures all that in, and he gets to put Made in America on his power tool. So that kind of decision, which actually predates Trump 1, so this is before 2016, suggests there was already some reconfiguration. So what that's saying is when it moves to Vietnam, or if it moves supply chain shift around, there is a flying geese pattern, which we've seen over history, which is when East Asia, when production moved out of Japan, Korea, moved into the rest of, moved into China, and now it's moved to Southeast Asia. It's a pretty well-established move. I just think it's been accelerated by the geopolitical pressures. And then this is why I'm using that as an example, because Made in America starts to look a bit, like you can sell more power tools. But I was genuinely surprised when, when this happened before 2016, because that was before you had all of these cost pressures and the real height in geopolitical tension. So a lot of this was actually happening under President Obama.
But to your point, Ed, you can't say a precise amount, because I talk to different companies around the world, and when I was in New Zealand, there was a company there. They said, well, previously we sold to America from our China production base, but we're doing the tariff arbitrage. We're now servicing the other markets from the China production, and we're servicing the US from what we produce in Thailand. So, it's very easy for us to say, okay, this much is transshipment, but the truth is where companies have got diverse production bases, they've had to be nimble in certain areas to use their China plus plus or China plus one strategy to serve the US market.
But does like a lot of that, so the kind of the structure of a modern supply chain, whether it's just in time or to some extent, I guess, just in case, it still depends on being able to assume that the ship is going to turn up. And, so does the fact that we've seen all of these choke points, under serious disruption now, not just theoretical, is there any kind of economic model that can kind of model that, or is that just such a kind of chaotic future? If you're worried about Malacca or even like, I don't know, Gibraltar or all of these different straits, are all bets off when those different choke points start to get genuinely choked, Janet?
Well, and I'm sure Silvana and Linda will come in here as well. If we make forecasts, we always have to base them on different kind of scenarios. But anything that adds friction to an economy, and uncertainty is bad for growth, and it's bad for the costs of producing, and it also influences companies and households' inflation expectations. So there is a monetary policy overlay to all of this, because if you look at, say, for instance, recent press conferences from the FOMC in the US, and Chair Powell was asked about tariffs. It's not like the tariff impact itself has been that much bigger than they'd expected on the good side. It's clearly adding to inflation. What seems to be surprising them is the stickiness of the tariff effect. It hasn't come down, it hasn't dissipated. And maybe that's because, you've had a tariff today, you don't know what it's going to be tomorrow, you don't know what the Section 232s, the Section 301s are going to be. So any opportunity you have to push through your cost increases and pass them on to the customer is that much easier. So it's, again, economists don't like friction at all. Anything that's friction is bad for growth, it's bad for the growth inflation trade-off, and creates headaches for policymakers. So I'm sure it's all sorts of things that Silvana's had to consider, given her experience.
Yeah, Silvana, got sticky, even stickier inflation. It's your nightmare as a former policymaker as well, isn't it?
Yes. So let me just talk first about economic models. I mean, there are now many models that take into account those choke points or critical inputs, critical links. And so we've become much better at those since COVID. People realize that was a very important part. And it goes back to, the Nobel Prize winner Michael Kremer had a model called a paper called the O-ring theory of economic development, showing how these small choke points could cause big disasters. So anyway, economists have more tools now to understand and identify those critical inputs, and this is part of where the focus should be from the perspective of governments and big companies as well. Identify those choke points. In terms of sticky inflation, if you think about what happened with COVID and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, these are two tail events happening, in less than 2-3 years. This is unusual, or was unusual at the time. So so a lot of the thinking, and this is part of the question in the chat, was, well, we could look through some of these because, they will unwind and inflation will not persist. And what monetary policy has to do is to, precisely deal with those second round effects that might stick. And that was a rationale for the response. It was not trying to offset the shock itself, but trying to offset the second round effects that might persist. And if you think about what happened for most economies, advanced economies, inflation was back to target in the spring of 2024. That was the case also for the UK. So despite the huge peaks in inflation that we saw, by May 2024, inflation was back at target. In fact, it fell below target by September 2024. What happens in 2025 is a different story. The government implemented a number of policies, including VAT on private tuition, VED, the vehicle excise tax. And once you start adding up all of these measures, there were measures on transport and minimum wage, that led to the additional overshoot or that we saw over 2025. And most predictions, more forecasts for this year before the Iran conflict were pointing to inflation back to target now in the spring of 2026. So anyway, so what I want to say is that absent this new shock, we would have been on target, and in fact, we would have been on target on the spring of 2024 and throughout, if since the spring of 2024, if there were no additional measures. Now the question is, what do you do when these shocks become more recurrent? And that's the question in the chat. I mean, of course, at the end you have to accept that these shocks are restricting supply capacity in the economy, and if demand doesn't adjust, monetary policy needs to come in and balance that demand on supply imbalance. So and that's what central banks will have to be.
Can I ask the cheeky question, which is, if you're still on the committee, come on, what would you be doing in the next meeting?
I think I will be pausing and wait and see how far this goes. I mean, again, this has been a roller coaster. We still don't know how long this conflict will persist, and in part the second round effects, which is what we care about, will depend on the duration of the conflict and how that feeds into second round effects. So clearly, the starting conditions are not the same as what we had before the war in Ukraine. So that will be a consideration. And so it's, me personally, I would be pausing, seeing where this is leading. I think the risk of entering a recession is not small. And that's going to be part of the consideration. On the other hand, it's been obviously many years of inflation above target, so that would factor in the calculation of central banks. But as Janet said, this is trade of territory, and this is not an easy position to be from the perspective of central banks.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting meeting. Sorry, go on, Linda.
No, I was going to say, if you're going to be too modest to plug your own books, I'll do it for you. And I'm going to cheekily plug my own and then one more book to kind of answer your question. So your book, Material World, I think covers very well this idea of security and commodities. And I think that is a shift in how we think about, understanding the impact of trade flows, investments, all the kinds of things, the kind of wiring of the global system. So no, this is where I plug my own book. And so
you are welcome to do so now.
So after a crisis is normally when we think about something, and that's exactly why, we think a lot more about security of commodities and shipping and all this kind of stuff. So after financial crises, this is after the global financial crisis in 2008, which I write about, that's when we really focused on banks providing critical economic functions, financial institutions, not creating a credit crunch. So then now moving to the third book, which is Edward Fishman's book, Chokepoints, because of what happened after, during COVID, and then after the various problems in not just the Strait of Hormuz, but think about, tensions over the Panama Canal, Suez Canal, whatever you have, that supply chain resilience and security also means that what you've seen is shipping becoming part of this equation. And perhaps one of the reasons why you didn't see a spike in shipping costs, obviously I'm talking before this year, is because you'd already seen rerouting around Africa, for instance, because even before this conflict, what you saw was the proxy war in the Middle East manifested through the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen lobbing missiles. So there's a lot more consciousness about a new model to begin to think about choke points, security, resilience, and what that means for energy, commodities, and the ability to provide, I'll just use a corporate term, business continuity in the event of either a price shock or a supply chain shock. So to me, the models have shifted, and there's nothing new. There's nothing new. We have seen this before, but somehow it always feels new. And I do think the the analysis these days, or at least are more explicit. I think we all probably miss the days in which supply chains and inputs were just a slightly boring commercial decision. And now I'm not surprised that If you look at the G7 communique from when the UK was last head of the G7, we will be again next year. Supply chain resilience was one of the highlights in that communique, and that predates actually quite a lot of the recent conflicts.
Yeah, I guess to some extent we're kind of rediscovering old models as well. Kind of new generations are discovering old models. Like that, for our generation, when we think about the dependency ratio, it's mostly about kind of old age dependency. But like there's previous generations and different types of economies that look at the dependency that call the extent to which you depend on imports a dependency ratio. I think in India, that's one thing that people think about. So we're having to reach back to different forms of different models. Let's.
I mean, on that point, Ed,
sorry, go on, Silvana. Yeah,
quickly,
sure.
that after the oil crisis in the 70s and early 80s, the US had a deliberate policy of having self-sufficiency in energy, and it's been very successful on that front. Other countries have been less successful or perhaps relaxed too much.
They got there in the end thanks to fracking, I guess. But yeah, it took them a while to get them. Let's do some questions. Should we start with and I want maybe Janet, do you want to do John Geeve's question, or at least I'll read it out, and we can't hear you actually. You're just on mute for the moment.
Sorry, I can't see any questions, so you will need to read them out.
I'll read them out.
Yeah.
I'll read them out. This gives me a sense of power, so that's good. John Geeve, is globalization retreating, or is it just stalling? Should we be setting policy to maintain an open trading relationship, but with mitigations of particular risks, for instance, on backup storage of materials or subsidizing key defense industries? Or should we be planning something more fundamental? And if it's the latter, to limit the cost, should we be rejoining the EU?
Well,
big question.
I think
No
it's very difficult to answer the latter question, but I don't mind hiding what I voted for, which was not for Brexit. But what I would say is that, one thing that's happened and given extra impetus for over the course of the last year is more regional trade deals and bilateral trade deals. So obviously, even the UK has already had its trade deal with Australia, but it's signed a trade deal with India. The EU has signed a trade deal with India. After 20 years of negotiation with the Mercosur countries, doesn't quite have a fully signed, sealed, and delivered trade deal, but they've put it in place provisionally with Latin America. So, the US tariffs has been the impetus for other trade deals around the world, be they regional or bilateral. And of course, the UK also joining the CPTPP. So it's, we've certainly got, we may have passed the peak of hyper-globalisation. And, some of that has been a consequence of the backlash by domestic populations. Globalisation lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but there were huge distributional consequences, which perhaps governments in certain areas didn't address those distributional consequences. But I think we are seeing a trade configuration, and we are seeing liberalisation still in certain areas. But that doesn't mean that we're not still going to see an increased focus on security, as Linda was saying. We get waves of this in the past. It was just a year ago when obviously there were a lot of discussion about NATO, and we had big announcements out of Europe regarding defence spending, which equity markets immediately rallied on the back of. But this is a long-term story over the course of the next decade. So, the military-related security, the energy security, which Silvana talked about, that's still going to be a long-term challenge. Maybe we get this whole new renewed push towards renewables and such like, and broader economic security happening as well. So, at the moment, the focus is very much on the goods producing part of the economy. But global manufacturing actually only makes up about 10-15% of GDP in most countries. Most economies are actually service sector based economies, and that's where so little of the discussion, whether it's about trade or the broader economy, actually relates to.
But I was just listening to Keir Starmer just earlier on today. I was quite struck. Obviously the tone in from not just from him, but from the Chancellor and for a while has been about, okay, the response in the face of aggression, kind of diplomatic aggression from the US is that we need to have closer relationship with the EU. But it's striking that the quandary we're faced with right now, particularly the UK and particularly Europe, is we're massively short of energy. And, right, we used to rely on Russia for our gas, for most of our energy, or a lot of our energy rather. And now we depend on America. And this is Europe as a whole. And so the UK becoming closer to Europe isn't necessarily going to solve that. And that kind of brings me to this other, back to your point, Silvana. The US wanted to be self-sufficient for energy. It had a kind of a policy for that. Do you think that, has it taken you surprised, both, I guess, when you're at the MPC, but also just more broadly reading, I guess, through the events of the last few weeks, the extent to which energy is impinging on economics? And do economists, either academic economists or policymaker economists, have enough of a handle of the impact, direct and indirect, of energy? Like, Linda was talking about those indirect products, kind of helium, urea, fertilizers, and so on. Have we been through a massive learning curve on that stuff in the last few years? I mean, I certainly have, but I wonder whether that's the case in academia and in policy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people were, stopped thinking about supply shocks for a while. They were concentrated on the demand side of the problems. I mean, in part because we've been through a long period in which supply was not playing a big role in our economies. It was mostly the demand that was falling behind supply, and it was the thinking was focused on how to stimulate demand to get inflation back up to targets, and that happened for many years. Certainly since the financial crisis. So there was a new effort which started with the pandemic. Many economists, academic economists, have shifted focus or reshifted focus to the supply side, and in particular in understanding these weak links or choke points in production. So I think they managed to map out basically where those critical inputs are, and so there's a lot more knowledge and awareness of where the focus should be put. Governments are behind, in some sense. I mean, they haven't picked up on all that learning, and I think this is urgent because we've already had two enormous shocks coming from the energy side, and all the derivatives that come from that need to be addressed.
And I think were you kind of partly answering the question from Philip in the chat, because he was asking about the extent to which central bankers can risk making the same mistakes of monetary policy in action by looking through the impacts of supply side energy shocks on growth and inflation.
So we can discuss a mistake. So you are back with the pandemic, and then suddenly you have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is, again, an enormous supply shock from the perspective of the UK. We're net importers of energy, and that's a very different position from the US, who are net exporters now. For the UK, this was a massive negative supply shock. For the US, it was a positive boost to its external demand, and you can see it in consumption. Consumption boomed in the US during the COVID pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine. Whereas if you look at the UK, consumption has been flat. We're barely at the level that we were before 2019. This was not a demand story. This was purely a supply story. Now, you can always offset an inflation shock by creating a recession, or deepening the slowdown in demand, and that's where we would have been if we push for even higher interest rates or even earlier. So it's always a decision on trade-off, how big you want your recessionary impulse to be in order to offset the shock to inflation. So this is why, I mean, typically the recommendation is not to try to offset the direct impact of the shock, because if you need to offset a 10% shock coming from energy, you really need a very deep recession. And we know that recessions are very costly long term. There are many there's a lot of hysteresis in the system, and you can damage supply capacity in the future. So that's why you want to be very careful. And this is where our remit, the remit of the Bank of England is very clear. So inflation, there's an inflation target of 2%, but in the event, and it says it very clearly, in the event of shocks that are large or persistent or both, the MPC needs to balance the speed with which it returns inflation to target. Why? Well, because you don't want to sink the inflation, the economy into a deep recession just to offset a temporary overshoot in inflation. That's very dangerous. And so when you talk about mistakes, okay, I think the answer is, well, how much higher you wanted unemployment to be in order to offset the inflationary pressures, and to get faster, much faster to the targets. And that's a discussion, and there are different views, and you can do the simulations on what you would have needed to do if you wanted inflation at target throughout the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And the answer is you needed unemployment to rise to double digits, and same for interest rates. So would that have been better? Would that have been called a mistake? We can discuss that. But certainly it's important to distinguish the position of the UK as a net importer of energy versus the US that was living a boom, a demand boom.
I suspect we'll be debating it for many years to come. Linda, do you want to do that? There's a question from Elgin saying, if the strait remains unpassable, say through April, how does that end up affecting input costs, calculations of central banks, I guess the wider economy? I mean, how concerned are you as you look at the Strait of Hormuz and just think, gosh, the longer that stays closed, the bigger the impact that is? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, it's another great question, and it's quite significant for the UK, because I think what's today? Wednesday? I think tomorrow is our last shipment of gas.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
there's aviation fuel coming in, I think, as well, in the next few days. Yeah,
I think it's the last scheduled shipment, and we normally get something like 7 or something like that. So I think something like 50% of our jet fuel comes from the Middle East.
Yeah.
So, and about 1/5 of the world's transport of oil and gas comes through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is, and of course, a lot of that's destined for Europe. That's what, and for the so I think if it remains closed, I think so one, there is a shock factor. So you already see, for instance, the price of jet fuel has doubled already since, I think, before the conflict from a month ago. I'm not going to suggest anything about how you're going to book your holidays, because I don't know in terms of airplane fares. But I think the broader question, and I think he's asking about central banks as well as the real economic impact. It's fair to say, I mean, we just don't really know what's happening duration-wise, but the head of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, he has, so I think, has repeatedly said this is worse than the 1970s. So the 1970s, 2 oil price shocks, one in 73 or 74, the Yom Kippur War, and then 79, which actually went on for about a decade, Iran-Iraq War. Those continue to be the supply side shocks that we have studied and, created the term stagflation. I think the reason why he's saying it's worse this time are the 2 things we've already discussed. So one is the impact on other things like commodities, like, and there's planting season. But I think the second reason is that there's economic damage to production facilities, not just for energy, but also for things like water. So when you have that kind of impact, then the shortage it creates a potentially longer lasting impact on importing countries. And we do import more of our gas, for instance, than comparable economies. So I think that's probably why, if you look at the OECD's latest forecast, inflation's forecast this year to hit 4% and next year to hit 2.6%. So that is suggesting for central banks who look at around a 2-year horizon, it really will determine how short is this shock, and therefore whether or not there's also real structural damage. This is not to say that government can't take mitigating actions, because that's always possible. The question is always the cost of it. So in discussing everything we're discussing today around trade, tariffs, protectionism, you can always offset some of the cost of living increases, but the fiscal choices involved in that are expensive. And so, so it's not, I don't want everyone, I'm sure this audience wouldn't, but you don't want to go away thinking, well, there's nothing that can be done. There are things that can be done. Silvana talked about what can be done on monetary policy, and I would say you can do stuff on fiscal policy, but the question is always cost. And there was a French politician who I can't remember who said it, but who said, to govern is to choose. And when you have situations like this, the choices are not just hard, they're expensive.
Can I just, because there's one question, I want to come to you in a second, Janet, but just quickly, Linda, question from Leia. Do you see the redirection of Chinese exports to other countries than the US, so connected countries, but also others like Latin American economies? Do you see it to be temporary and only to escape US tariffs, or more permanent trade restructuring?
There's a joke.
Just a quick one.
Yeah, there's a joke in the US, and it was said by Ronald Reagan, which is there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And I feel a little bit that this has now been temporary for so many years that, the context I gave is it's been going for over a decade, this reconfiguration. And I think it's in part geopolitical, but I also think it's in part because it is now cheaper because of technology. So when I say demand sensing, I should have illustrated what I mean. So you know how you can get something from Amazon within 2 hours to be delivered to you? That's because they have demand sensing technology. They know exactly what you're going to order, or roughly speaking, so you can do that in inventory. So what that is suggesting is supply chains are probably now less costly than before. And I just want to pick up quickly, I know we're short on time, the question around, does it cost more to ship around Africa? The answer is yes. But the issue is it's not a shock. There's like a normalization of a higher cost as a base of trade. And I think that's what's happening with supply chains.
Yeah, that's great. And as I understand it as well, the ships are basically running faster. So ships were previously not tending to run at their maximum speed. Now they're tending just to run a lot faster. They burn more fuel as well. So it's not particularly good for the environment, but that's another topic. Jana, there is a question here from James about, it says, apart from energy markets, in which markets or sectors should the UK pay to be more autarkic? I mean, it's not a word that economists enjoy, but perhaps that's the world we're in, self-sufficiency, to be more autarkic and more resilient to global shocks. Are there particular sectors or markets where it would make sense for us to do that? Steel, we're kind of doing it with steel, aren't we, already?
With steel a little bit, but energy is the key one. If I look at, relative to GDP, one of the biggest net exporters in the world is Norway of oil and gas. But if you look what they use domestically, it's actually a lot of it renewables, and they are world leading in electric cars. So I do think that energy is the big one. And I think the private sector is better at allocating capital, and there are things that can be done on the regulation and the tax incentive side to encourage investment in certain sectors, which is where government can play a role to encourage investment in areas where they prefer to be more self-sufficient. But I think we also need to be aware of where our comparative advantage lies, which is probably more focused in areas of the service sector, whether it's health-related, education-related, professional services. There is a whole array of different sectors.
Yeah, financial services, dare I suggest. So
just one of them.
We're kind of out of time. I don't know, Silvana. We've got still a few questions. Silvana, I don't know if you wanted to do the one about who's the big winner of this. Is it China of this whole shebang that we're in. Are you able to answer that in one sentence?
We all lose from this. This has not benefited anyone.
Okay, well there we are. That's pretty profound. Listen, we are out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to do all of them, but I think we did most of them. This has been really interesting, and there is another panel, actually. If you want more of this, there is another panel tomorrow at 1 p.m. Stephanie Flanders is going to be chairing it. It's monetary policy implications of the energy price shock. Spencer Dale, Christian Baumeister, Jack Meaning couldn't be more topical for where we are at the moment. But in the meantime, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to the panelists, Silvana, Linda, Janet. I've learned an enormous amount, and I will take away notes of things like the Kramer O-ring theory of economic development, which vaguely rings a bell, but I haven't read back into for a while. So I'm going back to that. Black and Decker costing the same in the US as California. I like that. 3D printed aircraft part. So for me, this has been my dream hour. I hope it's been fun for everyone else as well. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we can do this again soon. Bye.
Thanks, Ed.